Well, good morning. It's Don Airy here again with another main story, and I got a couple of warnings for you for this one. Number one, it's rated PG. If you don't think a Christian can tell a PG-rated story, I got another thing coming to you. We do. Number two, it's got a choking hazard. Remember that first video that I ever put out on this channel? There's some jokes have a choking hazard, because you just don't get them. They're wicked funny, but you don't get them right away. Later on, you might be eating something and you'll finally get it, and you might choke on your food when you're laughing about it. When you finally do get it, and so be careful. Okay, just be careful. I don't want you choking. Okay, it's about a man called Hiram Keyser. He was the grandson of Ebenezer Keyser, who founded the little township of Keyser Falls up there in Maine, and it's right next to Cornish. My mother lived there for many years, a little tiny town. It's one of them towns where, when it was first started, if you're trying to find it, if you were in Cornish, and you said, how do I get to Keyser Falls? The folks in Cornish would say, Keyser Falls? There's no such place. I'll tell you, that actually happened to me and the folks in my gospel quartet when I was in college, the Cosman Quartet. We were looking to go to a church called White in Maine, and we couldn't find it. I was back, in the 70s, and we didn't have GPS and things like that, and we were looking for White in Maine, and we stopped in the town and says, can you tell us how to get to Whiten? And they said, Whiten? There's no such town as Whiten. And it was the bordering town of the town we were in. It's just the funniest thing. So these things can actually happen, And so this guy, Hiram Keyser, he was the grandson of Ebenezer Keyser, and he was a hermit. Now, I don't want to give the impression that this guy was old. He was in his 20s. I don't know what happened to him to make him just turn away from civilization. I don't know if he had an abusive father, or if he was just ornery, if he just hated people, whatever turned him into that, but he just went off the grid, as we say today, And he had inherited a lot of money from his father and his grandfather's estate, He got a patch of land out in the farthest corner of Keyser Falls that he could possibly get, and he had a little dirt road, and the only time he'd ever come into town was to buy 12-gauge shotgun shells and 22 bullets for his 22, and staples like salt and pepper, a few things that he'd need to survive. He didn't own a radio. Just a bunch of noise to him. Said all the news he needed was a bird singing to him. Pretty good philosophy of life, if you ask me. And he did buy a bug zapper. Yeah, because his form of entertainment was to sit out at night on his porch, and have his Pabst Blue Ribbon beer and watch the bug zapper. Watch those little purple flashes that hit those mosquitoes and the gnats, and things as they hit the bug zapper. And every time they hit one, every time a flash would come on, he'd take a sip of his beer. That was his form of entertainment. He'd enjoy that. And he'd occasionally, he had one apple tree on his property, and if a deer came up to steal one of his apples, why, he'd shoot it with his 12-gauge, and that was his venison, and he'd gut and strip the deer and cut and butcher it up himself. He knew how to do that, and he had a smokehouse, and he'd make venison jerky, and that'd sustain him through the winter. He had a bird feeder, and he'd use his 22 to shoot squirrels off his bird feeder, and that became his dessert. And if you don't think that's funny, I'll tell you what my mother used to do. My mother had a 22, and she'd sit in her living room, and I'd bought her a nice bird feeder, and a couple of years later she says, Buster, can you get me another bird feeder just like the one that you bought for me there a couple of years ago? And I said, well, sure, but why? She says, because I shot it all full of holes. I said, why'd you do that, Mom? She says, because I was shooting squirrels off it. It turned out she had a sliding glass door that went off onto a porch, and then she had a good view of her bird feeder, and she'd sit with the door open with her 22 in her lap, and she's in her 70s this time, and she'd sit with her 22 in her lap, and when a squirrel would try to get on her bird feeder, she'd shoot at it. My mother was a lot like Granny Clampett to the Beverly Hillbillies, And anyway, that's just a little side story. But Hiram was not an educated man. He probably quit during kindergarten, I'd say, And he didn't have a television, didn't have a radio. He just lived the rough life. That's what he'd chosen to do. He was a hermit, Come down, he'd listen to gossip, every once in a while he'd buy in his staples. But otherwise he just lived alone. He just didn't care much for company or people, anything like that. He did have a telephone, though, in case of emergencies. And that must have cost him a pretty penny, because he lived so far out that he had to have the telephone company build his own telephone pole, to stretch the line. And if you're the only one on the line, you get to pay for your own telephone poles. That cost me a pretty penny. So we did have a telephone. And one night, he called the sheriff, the sheriff in the town of Cornish, because they didn't have a sheriff in Keys Falls. They kind of shared law enforcement in those days. This must have been back in the 50s, I think. I forgot to tell you that part. It was quite a while ago. He called and said, Sheriff, and I also tell you that there was the Ringling Bottom, I don't know if it was the Bottom and Bailey Circus or something, but there was a circus in town, and one of the elephants I'm really botching this story up, but you'll forgive me because it's 5:30 in the morning. I'm only on my second cup of coffee, and my heart's barely beating, But the circus had gotten in town. One of the elephants had broken out of its stall and had made its way all the way up into Keys Falls, and had gotten into his garden. Hiram raised cabbages and potatoes and carrots and a few other vegetables, and that it was just enough to sustain him. And that's how he sustained himself as a hermit. That's what he did. He enjoyed living off the land. And this elephant that he'd never heard about, he just, like I say, he was an uneducated fella. This elephant had gotten into his garden. He didn't know what it was. He'd never even heard of one. He called the sheriff. He says, Sheriff, he says, what's the matter, Hiram? You sound like you're in a panic. He says, well, you got to come up here. There's this fearsome beast that's in my garden. And, the sheriff was used to Hiram's antics, because of his entertainment, the Bug Zapper and the Pabst Blue Ribbon beer, He says, well, it's this fearsome beast. He's down there as big as my smokehouse shed. Oh, really, Hiram? Tell us all about it. He figured he'd had a long evening watching the Bug Zapper and drinking this Pabst Blue Ribbon beer, and he couldn't wait to tell his story. He couldn't wait to hear the story. He says, describe it to us. And he said, well, it's all gray. It's got legs as big as tree trunks. I've never seen it. It's got to be one of them mystical monsters that come out of the North Woods. I've never seen anything like this. He says, really? He says, what's it doing? And he says, well, you're not going to believe this, Sheriff, but it's got these big, huge flaps on its hindquarters, and it's got a tail like a great big huge snake, and it's digging up cabbages with its tail. And Sheriff, you're just not going to believe what it's doing with those cabbages.